welcome to CCTV News End of the Year Special Battlegrounds 2016. Over the next 60 minutes, I will give you a bird's eye view of what the world saw these past 12 months. 2016 was the year of political battlegrounds in Asia. The Islamic State was rolled back from the farthest corners of its reach. The Islamic State's leadership has appealed to followers from Amman to Paris to spread terror at home rather than join its besieged army in the Middle East. In Europe, the massive influx of migrants and refugees continued as more than 300,000 people, most of them from Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq, made the dangerous Mediterranean crossing. The battle of migrants is by no means ended, and the political aftershocks are just beginning to be felt. In June, the United Kingdom shocked the Western world when they voted to exit the European Union. But the most unimaginable battle of all, of course, was the election of Donald Trump. His historic win challenges the world status quo and portends uncertainty for the global economic order. The big powers' confrontation in the tumultuous Middle East continued in the year 2016. Like the battle in Syria, there are several forces within the war-torn country. On the government side, state forces are augmented by Russian airstrikes and Shia militias, including fighters from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Pakistan. The predominantly Sunni opposition is made up of several rebel groups, many of whom have received financial aid from key opponents of President Bashar Assad, including the US, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Hardline Islamist groups are also involved, most notably the Nusra Front. It announced it was cutting ties with al-Qaeda. The country is now suffering from the largest and most complex humanitarian crisis in the world. Now, in its sixth year, has no end in sight.
Not a word nor a cry. Omran Dakhnash, the 5-year-old Syrian boy, sat in the ambulance, wiping dried blood and thick soot from his face. But Omran is just one of thousands of children bearing the brunt of this war. This is the district where the battered boy lived in eastern Aleppo, Ash-Sha'ar. The district was recently retaken by the Syrian army. Inside one of these buildings sat ruined ambulances and large stockpiles of medicine. The army said this was a field hospital for militants from al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate.
Often we are accused of targeting schools and hospitals, but we are in a school turned into a field hospital, and you can see the logo spread here and who it did belong to.
The Syrian army, backed by relentless Russian airstrikes, managed to take eastern Aleppo from rebel hands. And in the recently taken areas, surprises were waiting.
The school you see behind me is the high school of As-Sakhur district, or at least it used to be. This district was under the control of insurgents up until December 2016, when the Syrian army regained full control of this area. This school is one of thousands of schools across Syria that was destroyed, rendering thousands of teachers unemployed and leaving hundreds of thousands of school children with absolutely no education. Syrian army officers are telling us that this school was used by the insurgents as a command center and as a place to manufacture weapons, in particular high explosives and toxic chemicals that could be used to make chemical weapons.
Toxic chemicals and explosives certainly seem out of context next to stockpiles of books for third graders. But this is now a country of sheer contrast. In this makeshift shelter, tens of thousands of Aleppo residents huddled to survive.
Since the war began, my sons went to Turkey because the rebels wanted them to fight with them. I was born in 1958 and I'm very sick. And now I have no family, I have no one but God.
Life goes on for these people. For many others, across the country, they try to pick up pieces of their old lives from the ruins.
As 2016 ends, the war in Syria goes on. And despite recent statements by the country's President Bashar al-Assad that retaking Aleppo would be a huge step towards ending the conflict in the country, many believe that the road ahead is still long and difficult. with millions of people displaced, hundreds of thousands killed, and parts of the country under the control of some of the worst terrorists in the world. The future is not looking very bright for Syria.
2016 saw tensions rise in the South China Sea. The dispute involved many neighboring countries, but it became much more complex this year because of the influence outside the region. Tensions in the South China Sea began to rise after the Philippines Aquino administration blatantly sided with the United States to initiate arbitral proceedings against China over territorial claims. In July, an international tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines. China ruled out accepting the ruling and claimed sovereignty and historical rights in the region. However, tensions cooled drastically after the current Filipino president, Rodrigo Duterte, made a strategic pivot away from the U.S. Mr. Duterte said that the Philippines would stick to an independent foreign policy. China and the Philippines have decided to set aside disputes to maintain regional stability.
Why are you veering towards China? Why should I not veer to China? China is good. It has not invaded a piece of my country all this generation. All the others to wander and do business, barter trade, even for the arrival of the Spaniards.
Many believe the arbitral tribunal was initiated at the instigation of the United States. While the U.S. takes no position on sovereignty claims in the South China Sea, the U.S. military has carried out several freedom of navigation operations in which ships and planes have passed close to the sites China claims. China has resolutely opposed these operations and demanded that the U.S. halt them. But persistent close-up surveillance and military surveys by the U.S. within Chinese waters have threatened China's sovereignty and security. The latest incident was a U.S. underwater drone. President-elect Donald Trump tweeted that China stole the device in the South China Sea. China accused the Pentagon of unreasonable criticism and said the wording was totally inaccurate. The U.S. recent actions could again stoke regional tensions and hurt efforts to resolve ongoing disputes. Events in this part of the world in East Asia have also found its way into the headlines. It's been an unusually turbulent year for the Republic of Korea, from nuclear tests and Pyongyang's missile launches to a political scandal which could see the country's first democratically elected woman as president ousted from office. It's been an eventful period, to say the least. Eugene Zhang with a look back.
Relations between Seoul and Pyongyang took a turn for the worse in 2016 as the DPRK launched multiple missiles on separate occasions. And it conducted 2 nuclear tests in the space of just 9 months. To deter threats from Pyongyang, Washington and Seoul announced plans to deploy the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, otherwise known as THAAD, in the southwestern part of the ROK. It drew serious concerns from China. And since October, the country has been rocked to the core by an influence peddling scandal centered on President Park's close friend of 40 years, Choi Soon-sil. President Park was stripped of her constitutional powers following an impeachment vote passed by the National Assembly.
What's happening now doesn't lack common sense, but it's preposterous. It's an incident that completely overrules all common sense.
The scandal has brought hundreds of thousands of people together in protest nationwide. They're demanding the unpopular president's immediate resignation. A 9-member constitutional court will now rule on the validity of the impeachment vote. 6 of the court's 9 justices must support the vote for it to pass. A presidential election will then take place within 60 days.
Should the new administration in South Korea come into office in the second half of 2017, its policies on the DPRK will determine whether current tensions on the Korean Peninsula will continue or if we will see a change towards dialogue and exchange. The second half of 2017 will be a watershed.
이게 대선이 이번에는
The president's term will begin as soon as the election is over and he or she is sworn in. So the biggest challenge for the next president is to gain control of the state affairs in a short period of time.
그런 문제점이 있어요.
Pundits are betting on the Constitutional Court to support the impeachment motion and for the next presidential election to take place sometime between March and June. The lengthier the wait, the longer this country will suffer a leadership vacuum, which could have adverse effects on peace and stability in the greater Northeast Asian region. Eugene Zhang on CCTV News.
Coming back in the studio once again, we have Teng Jianchun, China Institute of International Studies. In Seoul, South Korea, Jinjung Lim, a lecturer of Korea Studies at Johns Hopkins University. In Washington, D.C., Kurt Volker, he was the former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Welcome to the three of you. Ms. Lim, how should we understand the ever more complicated South Korean politics and its impact on the stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula?
Probably from the outside of the rest of the world's point of view, this turbulent political scandal might look like a kind of end of the country, but it's not at all. As you observed, I mean, the massive millions protesters went to the street, and which ended up without any serious violence or without killing anybody else. So my point is, again, this country is now trying to adjust and trying to purify our system, and of course it might take time. But I think within reasonable period of time, I think
we hope that will be the case.
Stable.
Mr. Tang, though, as South Korea's neighbor, China has a lot of concerns, not only about what is going on inside the country politically, but also the relations between China and South Korea. Missile defense system South Korea chose to have with the United States. It's a big concern toward China and Russia. What would these political infights now in South Korea mean for China's discussion with South Korea about some of the critical issues as itself sees it?
Actually, we have witnessed ups and downs in the relations between China and ROK since its normalization of relations in 1992. But the fifth nuclear test done by DPRK, I think, fundamentally changed the policy by the president in ROK, and which gave a very negative impact on the relation between China and ROK. This is actually a disaster for the two countries, I think.
At this point, Ambassador Volker, there are several important moving factors. One, political future of South Korea not clear at this point, at least. Second, you have a new president whose relations with South Korea and its Asian allies not clear. Thirdly, China, South Korea certainly have issues concerning the missile defense system, so has with Washington. Meanwhile, there's also the DPRK nuclear issue that 6 parties have really not been working on for a while. All of these moving factors, how should we look at this region and also peace and stability here?
Well, I think several of the things you mentioned are really not sources of concern. I think South Korea's political system, democracy, is very strong, and even though there's a political crisis engulfing the current leadership, I have every confidence that the South Korean political system will continue to evolve and be fine. Likewise, I think you're going to see some very familiar elements in the Trump administration, a strong but a predictable U.S. policy in Asia, and one that's going to be very consistent with past U.S. policy over both Republican and Democratic administrations. Where I do think that there is a concern is North Korea. As you said, there is not an effective process in place for dealing with North Korea's nuclear plans at the moment. And North Korea has a tendency, when it feels that other crises are dominating or that it is not gaining enough international attention, to create crises. And I think that is something we should be watching out for early in the Trump administration, early in 2017.
Do you agree, Mr. Tong, what our American counterpart just said?
Yeah, I think this is actually a game played by some countries, especially for the geopolitical competition in this region. Not only the nuclear issue, not only the domestic politics in ROK. Some countries just try the best to play a role in this region, because this is a very important part for the Asia-Pacific region. And in the history, we can see a lot of clash and even wars in this region. So I think every player in this game should be very cautious on the possibility to go into another war. This is
other
game.
Players, Mr. Tang, are right now across the Pacific. China is seeing this crisis evolving in its neighborhood. The question is, how is China likely to face this if it goes out of proportion?
Yeah, actually, I wrote a short paper in Singapore, and I said that China should take the responsibility, and not only as a mediator but also as a leading player in this game. And because any ups and downs or in wars, that will give China a lot of sufferings. This is a lesson we should learn from history. In the 100 years history, we can see a lot of sufferings for the Chinese people.
Leading player, that of course is a phrase you would like to suggest to the Chinese policymakers, Mr. Tang. But the question is, at this point, China still have major differences on some of the very important regional issues with some key players in the Asia-Pacific region. For example, the U.S. aligns relationship with Japan, with South Korea, and some of the other ASEAN countries. So let me go to Ambassador Volker in that regard. What do you make of the ever diverge future, it seems, United States and China see for the region and in the region?
China has had a policy recent years of trying to push the limits a little bit. There have been some very established, stable relationships over time, and China has been trying to test those and push those out a little bit. That being said, I think that the U.S. and China have a lot of shared interests in stability, in security, in navigation, in good relations with others, in trade, in economics. So I think the potential for a lot of U.S.-Chinese strategic cooperation is there, but we have to be cautious that it doesn't evolve into a more and more conflictual competition. The second thing is that the region itself is developing extraordinarily quickly and very successfully. If you look at the economic developments in countries everywhere from Vietnam to the Philippines, Singapore certainly, all of these places are showing that there is opportunity for growth and opportunity for a very dynamic and robust Asia-Pacific environment. And that's one that could be both beneficial to China and the United States.
If that is the case, how shall we see, Mr. Tang, the political changes going on and the office changes going on in some of the most important countries in the Asia-Pacific region, such as the ASEAN countries, the Philippines, as mentioned by Ambassador Volker, and also in Myanmar, the political changes happening over there. How is that leading role, as you said, likely to be played out?
I think we should have a clear-cut vision toward the reality now in this region. I think the background that the balance of power has been changed or is being changed. For example, in the South China Sea, actually China used to be very cautious in military drills and military cooperation, but nowadays China shows confidence in this regard and carried out joint military drills with Malaysia, with Myanmar, with Cambodia, with Thailand, and this is actually a new change for our policy. So this is actually a result of the balanced power and also the new feature in this region. I think my proposal to our government actually is that we should share our security in this region. Not only share economy, we have already shared our economy for decades, and we should share our security in this region. This is a dilemma for the United States and China.
Dr. Lim, is there enough trust in the region, not only in Northeast Asia, but also in the Southeast Asia, among all players, in order to build that strategic trust and the share of responsibility?
Yes, it's a very complicating situation. I can agree more with the other two panelists too. It's literally a complex interdependence situations. But in my opinion, still it looks like the great kind of rivalry between China and the United States is becoming increasingly real, which might be a huge challenge actually to the South Korea, not only just to South Korea, probably to Taiwan or other neighbors too. But still, I don't want to lose my optimism about the region. As Ambassador Volker pointed out, the United States and China shared many common interests too, and I definitely want to see more and more cooperative relations between the two great powers.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Volker, my final question for you for this part, that is, President-elect Donald Trump never had the governance capabilities and also experiences before. That is likely to be a big test once he comes into the office early next year. The question is, during this period of time of transformation, if he could make it, how shall we, all parties, particularly the government structures in all countries in the Asia-Pacific region, work its best to maintain peace and stability?
Well, I think Trump comes at this not from government experience, but with a lot of business experience. He has given every indication of being very practical, but also being very outcome-oriented. And so my advice to everyone who has been coming through Washington over the last several weeks has been, don't make any assumptions about what Trump policy will be. And also, don't lecture and react to things that haven't happened. Instead, try to focus on what the actual problems are, and let's look at practical solutions. And I think that will be a very effective way of engaging the incoming administration, talking about real problems and real solutions.
Final words from you as well, Mr. Tang, briefly. Any advice for the Trump administration from China's perspective?
I think the two sides should be very patient toward each other. Our assessment is that in the coming 1.5 years, there should be some ups and downs for the relations between China and the United States. But we should be patient because we have a lot of complementarities and also commonalities in this region.
Will we really be able to do that? That's a big question. Thank you so much, though, for the three of you. Teng Jianqun, Jin Zhang Lim, Kurt Volker, really appreciate it. You're watching CCTV News End of the Year Special Battlegrounds 2016. We will come back to you soon after this break. This was the year when the unthinkable became possible. The marginal invaded the mainstream, and Donald Trump, a property tycoon and reality television host, was elevated to U.S. Commander-in-Chief. Mr. Trump is the first person ever elected president with no experience in either government or the military. His victory represents the triumph of new wave populism over a comfortable political and financial establishment.
Ever since his November election win, President-elect Donald Trump has been laying the groundwork for major changes in American foreign policy, in some cases sending signals that could turn foes into friends and friends into foes. On Russia, Trump has expressed a desire to work closer with the Kremlin than Barack Obama did during his 2 terms, after the U.S. intelligence community, including the CIA, declared that Russia tried to swing the election. Trump and his aides pushed back.
I think he would accept the conclusion if these intelligence professionals would get together, put out a report, show the American people that they're actually on the same page.
On Israel, Trump signaled a reversal of Obama's support for a Palestinian state. Trump's pick for U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, supports the legalization of settlements and Israel annexing the West Bank. Friedman has also questioned the need for a Palestinian state and says he expects to work from a U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, a city still claimed by both Israelis and Palestinians as their rightful capital.
A Trump administration will never pressure Israel into a 2-state solution or any other solution that is against the wishes of the Israeli people.
And earlier this month, Trump took a new position on U.S. policy towards China, talking with the leader of Taiwan by phone, breaking with decades of precedent, saying the U.S. is not bound by the One China policy, a mainstay of Sino-U.S. relations, and tweeting that China stole a U.S. naval drone, then telling Beijing to keep it. Concern is mounting in Beijing, particularly over Trump's stance on Taiwan.
Adhering to the One China principle is the political foundation for the development of China-U.S. relations.
China is not the only country paying close attention. Iran is also watching to see if Trump upends the Iranian nuclear deal. And Cuba is also on guard to see if Trump reverses the historic normalization of diplomatic relations with the United States. Jessica Stone, Washington.
The U.S. election this year highlighted a dilemma of democracy and the decline of the party system. It is arguably the most unconventional, drama-ridden, and divisive in the history of American electoral politics.
I'm running for president.
To the surprise of no one, Hillary Clinton announced her candidacy for U.S. president in the spring of 2015.
So I'm hitting the road to earn
Clinton,
your vote.
hoping to be the first woman American president, delivered the news not in front of the media or cheering supporters, but in a slick, pre-produced video. In contrast, her eventual Republican rival, Donald Trump, made his announcement in full view, creating controversy that energized his supporters, promising to crack down on the number of Mexicans illegally entering the United States.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Trump appealed to a disaffected group of voters, vowing to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border and somehow getting the Mexicans to pay for it. It paved the way for a contentious campaign. Traditional civility went out the window. Trump drew huge crowds who often screamed, "Lock her up," when Trump talked about Clinton. She had her own controversy, using a private server for sensitive emails while U.S. Secretary of State. For months, Clinton dismissed criticism right up to the election, but eventually apologized.
That was a mistake. I'm sorry about that. I take responsibility. And I'm trying to be as transparent as I possibly can.
Across the U.S., polls and pundits showed Clinton had a strong lead and gave Trump little chance of winning. But Trump would not go away, even in the face of an embarrassing recording of a controversial off-camera conversation obtained by the Washington Post. Trump made lewd comments to a reporter in 2005 about what many said amounted to sexual assault against women.
You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet.
The short conversation got much more graphic. Trump found his voice in another outlet, Twitter. With simple phrases such as "Make America Great Again," Trump was able to get 18 million Twitter followers. And while his 140-character messages are often controversial, it did provide a way for him to keep his name in the media each and every day. And when the FBI reopened its investigation into Clinton's private email server, it dealt a severe blow to her campaign. The long, bruising race came to a head Tuesday, November 8th.
Last night, I congratulated Donald Trump and
Clinton suffered a stunning loss that left pundits and the media trying to explain what happened and why. Trump was able to turn a groundswell of populist support into victory, becoming the commander-in-chief of the United States. He takes office January 20th, and with the U.S. sharply divided, the scene is set for what some say could be a tumultuous tenure as president. Sean Caleb's in Washington.
Further discussion on the U.S. presidential results in 2016. We are joined in Beijing studio, Teng Jianquan, Director of American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. In Washington, D.C., the United States, Mr. Douglas Paul, Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Gentlemen, welcome. Mr. Paul, I want to start with you. What has got President-elect Mr. Trump into the White House? Is that his new toy, Twitter, or a divided country?
Well, Twitter was a very useful tool to keep him on the offensive, as your tape leading into this said. But the underlying fact is that the public in the U.S., a large portion of the public, especially in the central part of the United States, had felt that their political class was not serving their needs. And so I think, despite the many flaws of the candidate Trump, people said, we need a change and we need a big change, and he's the best choice on the menu today, so they went with Trump.
I see, but the question is, what's going to happen next? Mr. Tang, anti-globalization seemed to be one of the slogans President-elect Trump was emphasizing during his campaign. But what would that mean once he becomes president?
I think anti-globalization does not mean that the United States will never do the business with other countries. And to my understanding, Donald Trump is in favor of bilateral trade relations, not multilateral relations. So he suspended the TPP. And when you are talking the business with all the countries, that might show the United States in a weak position. But if the United States talk with only one country, the United States is always the superpower in trade. So this is actually a very important part for Donald Trump.
Mr. Paul, if bilateral certainly becomes the favorite, what would that mean for the global system?
Well, Tianwei, it's really hard to say because Trump is sending complicated messages. Director Tang has spoken correctly. Having bilateral negotiations gives the U.S. an advantage that in multilaterals is diluted by the power of others. However, when it comes down to multilateral arrangements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it is but 12 countries doing multiple bilateral negotiations. So Trump probably can reach over into the basket of TPP negotiations, and if he has a coherent policy, he can grab what's already been negotiated, try to seek some improvements with each of the partners, and move forward on a more liberalized trade agenda.
Is America going to only look inward and look itself, make America great again while the rest of the world suffer?
The United States is still the superpower today, and a lot of commitment to the outer world. So if you look at the remarks expressed by Donald Trump, during the campaign and after the campaign, we can find the very complicated signals to the outside world.
Complicated,
yeah.
That's the very sophisticated word both of you used, yet I would use it as mixed signals coming from Mr. Trump. Mr. Paul, you are very experienced with the Taiwan issue. Is the founding principal issue between China and the United States when they established diplomatic relations. President-elect Trump already challenged that, saying it could be a bargaining chip in the coming year. How is that issue likely to spill over, have other effects in the region and even beyond?
The reaction in Taiwan, I just visited Taiwan the past week, the reaction there is much more cautious. They're not eager to see controversy stirred between the U.S. and China over the Taiwan-related issues because Taiwan tends to lose in that kind of controversy. So people are hoping that this will be a lower-key issue in the near future.
The bilateral relations between China and the United States as a result of a new president is very much on the priority list when it comes to people's interests and concerns. How is it likely to move from here? Is China ready to handle with the nuances, to say the least?
Yeah, I think the background for the China-U.S. relation today is that the competition in security and cooperation has been intensified in recent years, and especially in the South China Sea, cyberspace, all the competition there actually gave a new approach to understand each other and to cooperate with each other.
Right. This is for the very first time, Mr. Paul, the internal, shall I say, partisan politics likely to have a huge influence on what the U.S. policy might be for the rest of the world. As the biggest power, some argue, United States of the world, what do you think might be the impact?
Well, the uncertainty, I think, is going to come from the executive branch because Trump is in the driving position for policy initiatives. If he has ambitions to really reform how international relations are conducted, he has not yet put into place the people he needs to carry out that kind of transition. We see much more on domestic policy, much more on international trade policy, but the choices for secretaries of state and defense are are not very far from mainstream American core interests in international affairs. But I wouldn't put a lot of emphasis on divisions within the Republican Party. The record is, over the last year, they've held together very closely in Congress. I think Trump is going to get what he wants for the most part, and it's going to come fast and furious.
Douglas Paul, Teng Jianquan, gentlemen, thank you very much. You are watching CCTV News End of the Year Special Battlegrounds 2016. We will come back to you very soon after this break. Welcome back to CCTV News End of the Year Special Battlegrounds 2016. For much of the year in the UK, the fallout from an extraordinary Brexit referendum has dominated life in Britain. Increasingly bitter arguments over whether it was the right thing to do are still raising. The British government is being dragged through the courts, while the European Union is playing tough on the negotiations that lie ahead. Richard Bastick reports on a year in which a divided nation voted against the established order and to end a 40-year-old relationship with the world's wealthiest trading bloc.
It was a campaign that dominated the first half of 2016. What appeared to some a slow-motion scramble to the height of the summer, and then a result that no one had seriously anticipated. Brexit finally arrived at the ballot box, and by a small margin, Britain was launched into a political and economic unknown.
I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
Prime Minister David Cameron immediately quit as his government collapsed amid Brexit recriminations. The country's financial heartlands were thrown into chaos as the pound hit record lows and share prices tumbled. So how did the unexpected happen?
Immigration from the European Union had risen to historic highs. In the run-up to the June referendum, some 650,000 people came to the country to live and work here, the highest number ever calculated. 250,000 of them were from the European Union, taking advantage of the EU's freedom of movement rules. In all, numbers 3 times government targets. New Prime Minister Theresa May's plan for Brexit, though, was a little more opaque.
Brexit means Brexit.
It turned out Brexit didn't mean involving Parliament, the Prime Minister keeping her cards close to her chest. The High Court, though, ruled she'd have to tell Parliament something. In Brussels, EU Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier was piling on the pressure.
Cherry-picking is not an option.
Promising to trigger Brexit talks in the new year, Prime Minister May added a splash of colour to her otherwise nondescript Brexit vocabulary.
Actually, we want a red, white and blue Brexit. That is the right Brexit for the United Kingdom.
As 2016 drew to a close, a dark side to Brexit was beginning to emerge. The government appealed against its High Court defeat, while the woman who led the charge for Parliament's voice, Gina Miller, received death threats. Of course, the difficulty going forward is how the UK can reconcile two such contradictory images of a Britain divided down the middle in a love-hate relationship with its giant neighbour on the doorstep, the European Union. Richard Bestick, CCTV, London.
The year began with thousands of people a day arriving in Greece. It ended with hundreds a day crossing from Africa to Italy. For now, EU leaders grapple with ways to manage the tide of migration.
Over 60,000 migrants and refugees have been trapped in Greece since the Balkan borders were sealed back in March. Now, many of these people have been staying in temporary camps like this one in northern Greece. This is the camp of Nea Kavala, which is very close to some of the Balkan borders up in the north. In many camps across Greece, the UN and various NGOs have been criticizing living conditions as dismal, especially ahead of a very harsh winter here in northern Greece. Temperatures often drop below zero. So this camp is one of the better ones because everyone here is staying inside these containers that have access to heat, and they also in this camp have access to hot water, though many residents told us that this does not happen very often. The deal between Europe and Turkey that was signed back in March has significantly curbed the flow of migrants and refugees into Greece, which is one of the two frontline countries of Europe's refugee crisis, along with Italy. So far, from the beginning of the year, over 172,000 migrants and refugees have reached Greece by sea.
Why we don't live in city or in town? We live in camp afar of town. The town Policastro, 8 kilometers. 8 kilometers.
It's too far.
It's too far. Why we live out here? 10 months.
Europe has promised to relocate tens of thousands of refugees from Greece and Italy, but according to the EU Commission, so far only 5% of the refugees that were supposed to be relocated have been able to find another home somewhere in Europe. That's mostly because several EU countries oppose these EU plans. At the same time, the vast majority of the refugees that are trapped here don't want to stay in Greece, and they want to move on to Northern Europe, preferably in Germany. So the options that they have here are very few. Either they apply for asylum here in Greece and have to wait for months until their application is processed, wait even longer to see if they will be accepted into a European relocation program, or try to find a smuggler to take them out of Greece and through the Balkan route to Northern Europe. Filia Contrafuri, CCTV, Nea Kavala, Greece.
Our discussion about Europe's future. We are joined once again, Teng Jianqun, China Institute of International Studies, and also Washington, D.C., Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. In London, Ian Begg, professional research fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. Mr. Begg.
Good evening.
The migration crisis still continues inside Europe. Besides the Syrian crisis, what are some of the other issues that's really letting this crisis ever evolving on your continent?
I think the biggest challenge for Europe is the two very simple words, burden sharing. How do the 28 European countries, or 27 if we exclude the UK, how do they deal with the sheer numbers of migrants that want to come into Europe when so many countries oppose taking any of the migrants? For example, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, several of them say, we are Christian countries, most of the migrants coming in are Muslims, therefore we oppose them. We do not want to sign up to the EU deal. And what this also points out to us is that at European level, the European institutions have only very limited authority to impose the settlements that they think should be undertaken. The Germans say there should be burden sharing. The Italians say burden sharing. The Poles, the Czechs, the French and the British say, no, we don't want burden sharing.
Ever complicated picture there, certainly. I heard a long sigh from Ambassador Volker from the U.S. The U.S.-EU relations, U.S.-NATO relations is still a big question mark with the incoming president, Mr. Trump. How much will this politically, once again, put more pressure on an already complicated Europe?
Let me start with the refugee issue. And the reason I reacted a little bit is just because burden sharing within Europe would not stop the inward flow of refugees, both from the conflict zones of Syria and Libya, but also economic migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, or those displaced by further afield conflicts such as in Afghanistan. So I think what's needed is a more cohesive European policy on borders, as well as an effort to address some of the sources of the refugee crisis in a more effective way. And that, I think, is the heart of what's there. Burden sharing itself will not deal with the refugee issue. That gets to your question about, well, what about the United States? Because I think for Europe to deal effectively with some of the sources of refugees, it needs to be a wider partnership with more players in the world, including the United States. I don't think that the United States is doing enough to actually try to resolve the Syria crisis. I think we should have done more in Libya and still could. I think that we still have an obligation to follow through in Afghanistan. So I think there's a lot that we ought to be doing together with Europe to try to turn around some of these crises that have provoked the refugee crisis.
Mr. Begg, your response to your American counterpart, and also now with the rise of terrorism we have seen inside the European cities, is there a new opportunity for others to cooperate with Europe? Will that be an initiative for Europe in the coming year?
Well, Ambassador Volker is absolutely right that the roots of the migration problem are global. They're not necessarily a European difficulty on its own. We have worldwide something of the order of 60 million displaced persons. They have to go somewhere. He's right that there is a multifaceted solution that's required. It's a security challenge, it's a foreign policy challenge, it's an economic development challenge for much of sub-Saharan Africa. But the trouble is, the international community just seems to be unable to get itself together on this. And every time a solution is proposed, it's shot down by national interests. This is why it's becoming so much more extreme. Clearly now terrorism is an added dimension to it after the horrendous attacks in Berlin, previous ones in Paris and in Nice. But that's only a symptom of the problem rather than being something that's going to trigger an immediate reaction.
Mr. Tang, the 3-year-old boy lying on the beach in Turkey is still with us at this moment when we're talking about migrant crisis. No solution in sight.
Generally speaking, I think the European continent is still under power transition from the Cold War pattern to the post-Cold War era. This is a very important and very tough job for the European countries. After the withdrawal of the United States in politics, in security, there is no individual country can play a leading role in the integration or regionalism in Europe. And the refugee challenge actually is only one of the obstacles for the regionalism, and there are some other challenges, including the financial crisis and also the terrorism mentioned just now. And I think the small boy or the kid just gave us a very impressive image on the beach.
Mr. Begg, complicated issue still for the Europeans to resolve yourselves. The coming year, many political elections in the capital inside Europe. Meanwhile, Brexit will still continue. How will all of these combined likely to impact Europe's agenda?
The threat seen by many of the mainstream political parties is that Brexit will give encouragement to the populist parties in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Germany and in France in a way which is going to undermine support for European integration. That's the great fear. Already you see, and particularly in France and in the Netherlands, the two leaders of the populist parties, who at the moment don't look as though they can gain a majority, but gaining power and shifting their emphasis away from their traditional right-wing support towards working class support in a way which is emulating what the constituency that Trump appealed to in the United States, saying you're the losers of globalization. You in the north of France or in the industrial areas of the Netherlands, you're the ones we can speak to and oppose these old parties who are not doing you any good. And I think the fear with Brexit is that process will become even stronger. And that's one reason why several countries in continental Europe are reluctant to give Britain too many concessions on Brexit, because it will be seen to encourage this form of secession.
Of course, all of these are critical issues for the year 2017. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Teng Jianjun, Kurt Volker, Ian Begg. Really appreciate it. You're watching CCTV News End of the Year Special, Battlegrounds 2016. We will come back to you very soon after this break. Welcome back. 2016 was a year full of the unexpected, from political upheavals to geopolitical uncertainties. It is also the time full of discovery, milestones, and the unimaginable. Join us count down our picks for the top 10 stories of the year 2016.
In September, China hosted the 11th G20 summit in Hangzhou. For the first time, the summit gathered the largest number of developing countries, and for the first time, the issue of development was given a prominent place in global policy. China has shared its wisdom in steering the world economy. A political black swan event for the White House. Although Democrat Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, an outspoken billionaire, Republican Donald Trump, won the election.
We always put America's interests first.
Plunging the US into a time of uncertainty. A massive influx of migrants and refugees continually poured into Europe, with more than 300,000 people this year. European countries still wrestle with the distribution of such an overwhelming number of refugees, and the future of the EU-Turkey migration deal is also in question. "52% voted to leave. It led to David Cameron's immediate resignation and the rise of the new Prime Minister, Theresa May. She has set a timetable to finish Brexit by 2019.
Brexit means Brexit.
But Britain was only the beginning, as Italians voted against constitutional reforms and nationalists across Europe rode on the same wave of populism. In November, Cuba ended a post-Fidel Castro administration after the revolutionary leader passed away at the age of 90. As one of the world's most extraordinary political figures of the 20th century, Castro's leaving marks the end of an era. Park Geun-hye is the first ever female president to be impeached in South Korea. Among other things, apparently letting her close friend extort funds from companies made Park unpopular among hundreds of thousands of protesters nationwide. In July, a faction of the Turkish military tried to overthrow the government. After raising a state of emergency, authorities locked up tens of thousands, and many more public workers have been suspended from their jobs. And that has also challenged US-Turkey ties and weighed on US-Russia relations. Syrian rebels, government forces and terrorist groups have turned Syria into a bloody battleground. And the Syrian army's full retaking of Aleppo may be the turning point of the incessant fighting that's been on for 6 years.
We did it.
A Big Bang in astronomy. First proposed by Einstein a century ago, the discovery of gravitational waves could open an entirely new way to explore the cosmos. It was the first time in a South American country, and the first time a refugee team competed. After months of debates on the Russia doping scandal and concerns over the Zika virus and Brazil's domestic problems, the Games finally took off and showed the world Rio's charm.
Finally, we have an outlook on the world in the year 2017. Will the incoming Trump administration tilt the balance in global relations, especially with China? Will the threat of the Islamic State evolve into something more insidious and sinister after losing ground? Will open trade between borders flourish or flounder on the wave of populism and ultra-nationalism? Joining us once again in the studio, Teng Jianquan from Beijing, Kurt Volker from Washington, D.C., and in London, Yin Beg. Gentlemen, welcome back. In the year 2016, Mr. Teng, China played the host of the G20 summit. 2017, BRICS countries gathered together. Once again, China is the host. What can we expect about this multilateral platform?
China will be more active in this regard, I'm sure, including G20, Road and Belt Initiative Conference next year, and also the BRICS Summit next year will give strong driving forces for the cooperation among all the parties concerned, and China, of course, will play a leading role in this regard.
Ambassador Volker, will multinational platforms still going to work from the Americans' perspective? Will the United States still join in this decades-old tradition?
Yes and no. I think in terms of will multinational platforms work, that is the key question, is that they need to work. They need to actually produce results. And I think that's what a new administration will be looking for, is outcomes. When it comes to being willing to take part in meetings and attend summits and go to these formats, I think there, of course, will be a willingness to do that. There'll be an understanding that that is a mechanism, but that itself is not an outcome.
There is going to be the rise of protectionism, populism, and also the anti-globalization trend, Mr. Beg.
Well, yes, Europe is facing the problem that it's had the best part of 20 years of very weak economic growth, and some countries in particular, Italy is one, have had zero growth over the last 15 years. And part of the challenge of dealing with globalization is that it tends to accentuate inequality across the world. There are groups who lose from globalization and groups who gain, but there's a big rump of people who are not winners from globalization, and they're the ones who are making their voices heard.
Who is likely to play a leading role in the next stage of globalization? What can developing and emerging economies do in that regard?
Sure, you're right. I think no individual country can play a leading role in international politics. This is a tendency for the whole world. No, protectionism or the bilateral approach can give any, significant impact on such a development. And also the informationization of our society. A Twitter presence is already there. So this is very important for us to think about in a new vision, not only zero-sum game.
If you were being consulted by your national leader and international leaders, what best advice would you provide to them if they could listen? Let's go with Ambassador Volker, 20 seconds for you.
I think that you have to understand that many of the relationships that we've dealt with are long-term. And we have a lot of things in common with a lot of people. So while we want to be more practical about the outcomes and pushing a stronger national interest, we have to do that in partnership with a lot of other countries that share our same values.
Mr. Beg.
I would advise Theresa May and her counterparts on the other side of the English Channel to concentrate on getting a win-win outcome from the negotiations on Brexit, because getting it wrong has the chance of damaging both sides. Therefore, they have to realize that economic integration has benefits, and they have to publicize those benefits and make sure they don't forgo them by mishandling negotiations.
Mr. Teng, final words, your advice for your national leader and also international leaders.
To be more willing to share everything, to share our security, to share our politics, and to share our economy, to share our responsibility.
May I say, gentlemen, you're sharing the same mind. Partnership, win-win, and also to share, as always. Thank you so much. Teng Jianquan, Kurt Volker, Yin Beg, really appreciate it. Happy New Year to all of you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Same to you.
Well, whatever unfolds wherever in the world, You can count on us and our team of reporters to be there to get you the most comprehensive coverage possible. I'm Tian Wei, and from all of us at CCTV News in Beijing, we wish you and all your dear ones a very happy new year. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.